Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Country Nurse Remembers, True Stories of a Troubled Childhood, War, and Becoming a Nurse, by Mary J. Macleod. Narrated by Christine Rendel. Introduction. The story is of a confused, chaotic and repressive childhood lived in the West Country before, during and after the Second World War. My childhood, in fact, my life as well, was very clearly defined by a before period and the after. Before, my mother died in 1937, when I was just 5 years old. These years are the lost time, the joyful time, and the events that followed after. At her death, I was shunted from one relative to another, attending 3 different schools in as many months. My father was a man of his time, not expecting to look after a child himself, so he married again, only 9 months after my mother's death, perhaps partly to have someone to look after me. After my father's remarriage, my name was changed from my mother's choice of Mary to Julia. My father started to tell me that this new mum, Mildred, was a better mother than my own would have been. Then my stepmother told me that my mother had not even wanted me. All these things made me an unhappy child, but I did not realize that I was unhappy. Things were just the way they were. My experiences are set against a background of the Second World War. Evacuees came and went. Father built an air raid shelter. A plane crashed in the village. My stepmother's parents and cousin were bombed out in Bath and came to live with us for a while. German prisoners of war worked for my father for a while. There were sirens and air raids, and although the village escaped lightly, we spent many nights in the shelter as bombs landed around us. I gleaned what I could from playground talk, but my concept of events, local and global, was patchy, inaccurate. I was not allowed to listen to the wireless or read newspapers until late in the war. But those events that did enter my consciousness were to have a lasting effect on me and shape the way I thought for many years after. I won a scholarship at 11 years old and tasted freedom from home, eventually choosing to study medicine and train as a nurse at Bristol Royal Infirmary. The hospital rules were severe, but consistent, and I was growing up all the time, learning about life as well as nursing. I felt Mum's control gradually loosening, and I slowly began to have my own opinions and develop my own character, priorities and sympathies. I finished my 3-year training, passed the final examinations, and gained state registration when I was 21, officially an adult. The before time, the child. Hush! The child is present. Firmly, my grandmother admonished grandfather. He had been sitting in his big leather armchair with his head in his hands. Crying, he had just murmured, "I do grieve. Indeed, I do grieve." I was the child. I knew that, and I knew why he was grieving. Mummy. I was only 5 years old when my mother died. To me, she was the person who was always there, always loving, always ready to soothe or cuddle, able to find the lost doll, to locate the ice cream van when we heard the ding-dong, to tuck me up in bed. I was safe, secure, and fortunate, without knowing it. I took her presence and her love for granted. Then suddenly, she was not there anymore. I had been taken to my grandparents' home nearby one day. They said, "Mummy is not very well, but has gone away to hospital to get better and will soon be coming home again." But she didn't come home again. Ever. My memories of that time and of my mother are fragmented, and I only pieced them together over a number of years. At the time, I was not supposed to think about her. It was bad for me. She was best forgotten, I was told. I certainly did not dare ask about her, or reminisce about when Mummy was alive. It seemed that they all thought her death did not matter to me too much. "The child does not appear to cry over her mother," they said. It mattered. Oh yes, it mattered a great deal. But those were the days of the stiff upper lip, when children were to be seen and not heard, and we certainly didn't ask questions. In those days, a motherless child was a problem. Fathers rarely attempted the care of small children. Some woman in the family was always found to do this. I knew nothing of the current attitudes, of course, but I could feel an atmosphere in the house, almost of embarrassment, that told me to remain silent, not to cry when among people, and to hide away from all these things that I was deemed not to understand. I was not aware that I was miserable and lonely. Things were just the way they were. I heard all the talk, or snippets of it. She does not understand. She's a quiet child anyway. She will soon forget. She is so young. But I didn't forget. Not for a minute. Everyone talked about it among themselves, but only once did anyone speak to me about Mummy's death, and that was immediately after she died, at least I think it was. My father told me, "Mummy has gone to see Jesus." At first, I wanted to ask why she could not come back when she had seen Jesus, and why she had not taken me with her to see him. But I was a product of the old-fashioned attitudes, and had no proper religious teaching or understanding. I had a bluff, preoccupied, unimaginative father, who was doubtless in shock and grieving. So I kept all this worry to myself, and only by what I overheard was I able to understand that my mother had died. I knew what that meant. Death. And dying. I don't know how I knew. I think it was to do with a chicken that had been killed by a fox. I remembered that the chicken had also gone to see Jesus. The early years. Mummy had been slim and rather elegant in the tube-like dresses of the 1930s. Naturally, as a small child, I did not think of her like this. Mummy was just Mummy. She smelled nice, had a soft voice, and wore pretty dresses. I was an adult before I found a photo of her, and even now I have but 3. One of them shows a smiling lady holding the hand of a small, rather thin little girl in a sun hat, walking along a seaside promenade. I must have been about 4. Neither of us knew that this would be the last picture of us together. In less than a year, she had gone. Another lovely memory of mine is her blowing up balloons for Christmas. I recall Mummy and my father putting up paper chains and then sitting by the fire with the balloons. I know that I sat watching them, and a warm feeling, even now, tells me that we were a happy threesome. My father had more puff, so he did the blowing, while my mother tied the balloons' necks. But she was not very good at it, and they kept zooming off across the room. I loved that. I remember some words exactly. "Why do you try to take the long end through the knot?" my father asked. "I'll try the short end," Mummy replied. Pause. "You've done the wrong one again," he said. "I did the short one, so now it is the long one's turn." Why should I remember such trivia when there must have been many other conversations that I overheard? Could it be that the atmosphere of love and joy etched this little piece of nonsense in my mind? Then there was the doll episode. Again, I must have been about 4, because I was going out of the front door by myself to play with some friends on the communal grassy area in front of the houses. I had in my arms a fairly large doll called Margaret. As I went down the steps, Mummy came running out, calling, "Don't take your dolly. Those boys might get her again." By which I gather those boys had caused trouble with Margaret before. I must have been an adventurous child. We moved house soon after this, and there were some derelict buildings on the opposite side of a wide, shallow stream which ran in front of our house now. I was warned sternly by Father not to go there, as they were unsafe, and so far as I remember I did not go into these buildings, but spent much time standing beside the stream, looking at them. Occupied in this way one day, I was startled by an old man emerging from one of them and shouting at or to me. I was terrified, and in my hurry to escape, I fell into the stream. I was in no danger. The stream was so shallow, and this ogre of a man was kindness itself, pulling me out, establishing, with difficulty, where I lived, and returning me to my mother. She was not at all cross, but wrapped me up, cuddled me to get warm, and then made the old tramp a cup of tea. Father, however, was cross when he came home, but as always, Mummy smoothed things over by saying, "She didn't go into those houses. She was only looking at them." I remember my father's My next 2 adventures must have happened in the few months before her death. I had a tricycle and was persuaded to go out with some friends who were also the proud owners of similar small trikes. Near our home, some new houses were to be built, and the roads had been laid out and partially surfaced, ready for work to begin. Since they were totally free of traffic and ran down the side of a hill, they were considered by my friends, all of whom were a good 3 or 4 years my senior, to be most suitable for a good whiz. And they were. I began to whiz with the rest, but the trike was new, and unfortunately I had not mastered the use of the brakes. Faster and faster I went. I remember the shouts of encouragement behind me. We were all totally oblivious to the dangers. The road ended in a T-junction, and I failed to negotiate the corner and was unable to stop. I careered across the road and hit the newly installed curb with my head. I woke sitting on a stool in the workman's hut, with a grubby but kindly man sponging the warm, sticky stuff that was pouring from a cut on my forehead. At that moment, my father arrived, having been fetched by the other children. Pressing his handkerchief to my head, he wrapped me in something and carried me to the car. Holding the mangled tricycle out of the open driver's window with his right hand, I remember that so vividly. He drove me home to a distraught mother, who was being regaled by the children's tale of accident and blood, much embellished, I believe. Some time later, I recall Father saying to my mother, "I want to give those chaps something for their kindness." I don't remember what they received. While still with plasters all over my face, I went to call on a little friend. On her doorstep was her very old spaniel, sleeping soundly. I was very fond of dogs, so I bent to pat him, startling the old dog, which had not heard my approach. Frightened, he turned quickly and bit instinctively. My already battered face received several additional bites, as did my neck. For some reason, instead of knocking on the door, I ran all the way home, once more with blood pouring from me and terrifying my poor mother. But I know that I received love and comfort. Perhaps I had been foolish, but it was an accident, and that was the end of the matter. I think it was with the same little friend that I shared my next adventure. I believe her name was Audrey, and I remember her as being small and always dressed in blue. She was slightly younger than I was, and therefore I was considered to be the ringleader in our games or escapades. Near the house with the stream in front, as I always thought of it, there was a little park with flowers and swings. One afternoon we went there and spent a long time on the swings. We tried to outdo each other to see how high we could go before the ropes bent and jerked. I seem to remember that we went very high. These days, parents would be unlikely to allow 5-year-olds to go to a park, even a nearby one, unaccompanied. But life was safer for children then, and we were free to make our own fun. At the park, there was an old man who swept up and kept an eye on the children's area. We spent a long time chatting to him from the swings. He must have been a patient old fellow, because he kept saying that he would have to shut the gates, and we kept saying, "Just one more swing." We were the only ones left there, and I remember that the sun had gone in, but as children we had no idea of time. The old man did not tell us to go, but kept asking if our mummies would be worried about us. With great confidence, we assured him that we were allowed in the park. I don't suppose he knew what to do with us. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the gate, and Daddy and Audrey's father came striding towards us. They stopped to speak to the man, who smiled and nodded towards us. We got off the swings and ran to the two daddies, with our usual grins, no doubt. We were amazed when we saw their faces. I think they were cross and relieved at the same time. We had apparently been out for hours and had forgotten to tell our mothers where we were going. And it was not that the sun had just gone in. No, it was getting dark. We were scooped up and given a good talking to, plenty of hugs, and a piggyback home. Poor Mummy greeted me with tears of relief as she held me tightly. I couldn't understand this at all. We had been fine, I reasoned. I remember being made to sit down and listen to Daddy telling me why they were worried. There was a long, deep brass fender in front of our fire, and 2 square leather-topped wooden boxes, like small ottomans, were attached at each end to form seats. One held old newspapers, and one contained sticks, both for lighting the fire. I used to like sitting on these, and I can almost smell the brown leather, as I remember my mother holding my hand that night as I sat on a box as Daddy talked. All these years later, I can still feel the warmth of my mother's love, known for just those few years, not even understood, but perhaps more precious because it all ended so soon. Grandparents and aunts. There were other members of both my parents' extended families who lived fairly near us, and so were part of my early life. When at my father's parents' home at Meadowview, I had to be grown up, even at the age of 4. These grandparents seemed very, very old to me, probably because they both suffered ill health in different ways. Grandma had been totally blind from the age of about 30. As a very small child, I understood that this meant she could see nothing at all. So I wondered how she knew when I came into the room, or where in the room I happened to be. I was sure that she had a magic way of knowing when I was there and where things were kept, like Grandpa's slippers or the ornaments on the side tables. Much later, I learned that her hearing had become more acute as her blindness progressed, and she had developed the ability to interpret little sounds, such as footsteps. She could judge the rough weight of a person by the noise that the feet made on the floor, so she knew if it was a child or an adult. She also had a phenomenal memory for the way in which everything was arranged in the house. Woe betide anyone who moved anything without warning her. It must have happened, though, because I remember her poor wrinkled face always had bruises where she had bumped into a half-opened door or fallen over a chair carelessly left protruding from the table. She had a dog called Flossie, a gentle, fluffy creature who happened to be blind too. Flossie always moved out of Grandma's way when she heard her feet coming, but would stubbornly remain where she had decided to lie if anyone else tried to pass. She seemed to understand that we could see her, while Grandma could not. Doggy magic, I believed. I remember asking one day if we were going to see Flossie, and having to be reminded that we were going to see Grandma and Grandpa too. I loved Grandma and Flossie in about equal amounts, I think. I was afraid of Grandpa. As a result of a stroke, his left hand had set in a claw-like shape, and he had no real appreciation of the strength that still remained in it. He would play at rough and tumble with my cousins and me, and had no idea that he was hurting us by squeezing, prodding, or pulling us. We had all been told that Grandpa had a bad hand, and we must not complain if he hurt us because he can't help it. We did as we were told, of course, but often tried to slink away so that he should not see the tears. I can remember the terror I felt one day when he held me down for so long that I thought I was going to scream. That would not have done at all. Under his rather rough exterior, however, he must have been something of a gentleman, because one day, to our enormous relief, he decided that we were getting to be young ladies at 5 or 6 years old, and it was not seemly to play fight any more. When I look back on these times at my grandparents', it is often without the warm feeling that trickled down through those years when my mother was alive. I can't hear a voice in my head that could have been hers. This makes me think these years must belong to the after-time. But then again, it was perhaps just that her quiet presence was somehow overwhelmed by my father's large family of a brother, a sister, nephews, nieces, and it seemed an endless parade of aunts, all of whom seemed to look alike to me. Auntie Ginny. There was one aunt who stood out from the rest, Auntie Ginny. She was not part of the great gaggle of aunts in my father's family, but rather my mother's aunt. So, in fact, she was a great aunt to me. She was a tiny lady who had lost her husband in the Great War. She spoke of this long-dead, much-loved heroic man with great reverence. She always referred to the Great War. So I thought it was something splendid, imagining shining armour and glossy horses. It was only after school history lessons that I realised she meant the First World War. The Second World War was a few years ahead then, and so the Great War was still thought of as the war to end all wars. She lived in a tiny cottage in a little town in the Cotswolds, and we used to go to stay with her quite often when my mother was still alive. My father did many odd jobs for her about the cottage, while I helped to dig the garden. Mummy would rattle about in the stark kitchen, making all manner of nourishing foods for Auntie, being convinced that she did not eat properly because she lived alone. The kitchen was more of a scullery, because the actual cooking was done on a huge old range which stretched the length of the living room and was faithfully black-leaded daily. The big china sink in the kitchen was very low down, supported on two little brick walls, while a board placed across one end of the room held back the coal heap. I remember a lot of talk about the dust from the coal getting into the food, but we just washed the dust off the plates before we used them. Daddy said it was clean dirt. The front door led straight into the living room from the pavement. In order to reduce draughts and add a little privacy from passers-by when the door was open, a huge settle was placed inside the doorway to hide the room. Looking back now, I believe it had been a church box pew before being demoted to Auntie's cottage. In front of the fire, the open part of the range, was a rag rug that I remember Auntie once repairing with some old stockings. I was allowed to cut the thick material into small pieces for her to hook into the holes in the ancient rug. A comfortable old settee faced the fire, while a sort of chaise longue, Auntie did not call it that, it was the couch, was placed against the wall under the window. I used to stand on this and watch the people walking past. Somewhere in the room there was a square, highly polished dining table with a huge china something in the middle. The room must have been smaller than I remember, and probably very cluttered, but I loved that room. There was no bathroom in the cottage, and I remember being washed in front of the fire, and my clothes warmed on the fender. The lavatory was in a little brick building outside the back door. It was very cold in the winter, but I liked the picture of Jesus that hung on the wall. Many more pictures of a golden-haired Jesus with a shining halo adorned the rest of the cottage, as did images of a stately St. Francis. I liked the animals and birds that always surrounded him. Another picture showed God sitting on a cloud, and I know I used to feel uneasy sometimes when it rained, because I would worry that God would get very wet. But where did he sit when there were no clouds? That was another worry. I was intrigued by a particular picture showing Jesus knocking at a door overgrown with weeds. Much, much later, I learned that this was a print of the famous Holman Hunt painting. I think Auntie's interpretation of these pictures was about the nearest I got to any understanding of what it was all about. because my father prided himself on being an
Sample complete. Ready to continue?